welcome to Anna Lysyanskaya. This is Epic Talks, and I'm Alan Butler, the Executive Director and President at Epic. It's really great to have you here, and we're interested to hear about your work and some of the implications and also recent overlap with what we've been looking at in recent times. But I just wanted to start it off by giving you a chance to kind of introduce yourself, give a little bit of background, and especially into how you got interested in cryptography research and became a leader in that field.
So, okay, let me introduce myself. So my name is Anna Lysyanskaya, and I am a professor of computer science at Brown. I've been at Brown since 2002, so it's basically my entire adult career. I got my Ph.D. at MIT, also in 2002. And my work has always been in cryptography and in privacy-preserving authentication. So how do I convince you that I am authorized to access a resource without revealing any information that is irrelevant? So that's kind of the broad subject that I've been working on. And the way I got interested in it had nothing to do with sort of the privacy mission, but everything to do with math. I was just, a very bright-eyed and bushy-tailed PhD student, freshly arriving at MIT in '97, and wondering what should I do. And then I ran into Ron Rivest, possibly in an elevator for the first time, is where I met him. And he said, "Oh yeah, I'm looking for new students. There's so many exciting open problems in cryptography, and here's a paper on group signatures. Why don't you read that?" And I thought, oh, wow, I have a chance to work with Ron. That's fantastic. So I just got started, and then I never stopped. So that's how I got interested in it. And along the way, I got more interested in the sort of broader implications of these technologies on society. And that's how I got involved with Epic.
Great, yeah, and that was exactly into my next question, which is, you joined the advisory board in 2014, and you started to obviously work on more of the overlapping areas where computer science meets policy. What was like do you have any interesting stories or anecdotes about kind of your first forays outside of, as you say, the math side of this and into the policy side?
So I don't know if it's particularly interesting. It's more kind of it's a little bit more on the, okay, we have this math, and now where do we begin convincing people to use it, right? Because I mean, if you work in a technical field, in an applied technical field, then you're like, okay, I've done something, I think it's really cool, now I want people to use it. As opposed to, oh, there's an actual real problem in society that somebody needs to solve. It's a little bit wagging the dog. So I was very excited about all the European efforts to all these data minimization and the fact that the EU was actually funding a lot of this work. So that funded a lot of my joint work with Jan Kamenisch, although they didn't fund me directly, but they funded him at IBM, and a big chunk of that was the let's actually build something, let's apply it, let's inform policymakers. So that's how, I guess, that was probably my first taste of actually the stuff that I'm working on can be applied. And then somewhat later, NIST, well, actually not NIST, actually, okay. So here's a personal anecdote of technology mid-policy. So I went to a conference on that in 2000, actually I don't remember when exactly, at some point in the first Obama term. I went to a conference in DC, one of these technology mid-policy, and I thought, well, if the Obama administration is looking for some vision for how they can lead and how users online can be authenticated and granted privileges, then I need to inform them about these privacy-preserving authentication methods. And this was like a lovely, very lovely conference. And at some point, or like early in the day, somebody walks in, and I'm like, oh, this is the guy from the White House. I'm like, okay, this is the guy that I need to impress. And so I impressed him, and he was very interested in my work. And he, asked me if we could have a beer afterwards. And I'm like, okay. And now we're married. So so that's a very personal technology meet policy story. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, I mean, that is technology meets policy meets real life, right?
Right, exactly. So that had a little bit of, I mean, he was working on this Obama policy called NSTIC, National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. So they put out this document about how authentication of, how they can carry out authentication of government employees, federal employees, but also what that means for industry. And then they wrote this document, which is actually rather visionary, probably for 2000, I think 2010 or 2011 was when it came out. And then they handed it over to NIST, where it's been sitting ever since. And I guess when we started talking about, this just a couple of months ago, right? NIST put out something in the Federal Registry about looking for like approaches. I thought, okay, well, they're still basically exactly where they were with this 10 years ago.
Yeah, and that brings me to kind of my next question, which is, one, I guess, give you an opportunity to talk a little bit. I know you have to talk through this all the time, but to explain a little bit the basic concepts of what you work on, which is anonymous credentialing systems, but then also building off of what you mentioned about your work with IBM or others, how and where this stuff starts to be seen in the wild, or what are the opportunities for the use of this technology?
Well, the honest answer is, where is this stuff used right now? It's not used. Where do we want it used? Is actually everywhere. And I'm not just saying that because I want it, because it's stuff that I've been working on. But so let's say that you are the federal government, and you want to authenticate your, like, so you want, you have maybe a physical resource like a building, and somebody can enter the building if they have the right clearance. So how is it being used? How do people gain physical access to buildings today? Is they show their credentials, possibly to an actual person who verifies, do you have the right clearance? Or maybe they have an authentication card that says, I am, whatever my alias is, because maybe I don't even reveal my actual name, but this is my alias, and it has the right authorization. And that potentially means that now whoever the security guard is now privy to some information that maybe you don't want him to be privy to. Like he's in charge of checking that you have access to this door, but he himself doesn't have access to the door. So now you're trusting him, and maybe you don't want to. So even if we just say, okay, personal privacy, like even as outside of personal privacy, if all you want is for the federal government to have some confidence that it is, being very judicious about access to protected resources, even then you want a privacy preserving mechanism so that the security guard who's standing there doesn't learn anything other than the fact that you gained access to the door. I think that is why the federal government's maybe sort of waltzing with this a little bit. And if we care about personal, and of course at Epic we do, if personal privacy is paramount, then why should people with clearances have this kind of protection and ordinary people not have it? Like, why is it that you leave all these crumbs of data behind you every time you go, especially if you want to prove that you're an authorized user? Now you're telling them a lot, and whatever you're telling them is actually authenticated by some trusted resource. So in principle, I think that we want as in like whoever's privacy conscious, would prefer that this be the default method of authentication. Is I can convince you that I have authorization and I'm not giving you any information that is of no concern to you. But that's sort of the kind of the big vision. But in terms of what is, then there's, okay, so nothing, right now this is not used. I'm saying that probably this should be the default method of authentication. So the next question is, well, is it sort of ready for prime time? Like, do we have algorithms that we could just plug in, and suddenly when we were like before we used some kind of certificates that are not privacy preserving, can we just swap them out and use privacy preserving certificates? And the answer is the industry is kind of going in that direction, but I don't think it's, you know, ready for the kind of universal adoption that I advocate. I think that there are algorithms that work. Some of them have been implemented. I think there's a lot more work that needs to be done to make them standard, interoperable, ubiquitous. And some of the work is not even in sort of implementation, but more kind of educating the designers of various applications that this is a possibility so that they can use it. So it isn't enough to just say, here's a cool cryptographic algorithm, use it. You actually have to maybe explain what it does and why somebody wants to use it. So I think that the consequence for policy is that if we are looking for recommendations for what needs to be done today, in terms of, you know, use this technology, don't use that technology, it's not like we can say, oh, you know, just instead of username and password, just use anonymous credentials. That's not fair, because there isn't something that we can just say, use this product that's ready for the market. But if we're talking about long-term policy, like, and, you know, advice for the Biden administration, for example, like long-term, what kinds of technologies do we want the federal government to use to authenticate employees, which is the question that NIST was asking, I think, in this Federal Registry topic. Then the answer is, it's a good idea if the federal government does not lock itself into an authentication strategy that is not privacy preserving. Like, it's good if whatever it is that they adopt today is flexible enough that as soon as we have a good anonymous credential product, we can just put that one in. And in terms of like, why don't we have one? I mean, I'll talk about it a little bit, and like once I explain what it is. There are some implementations, there are some products, there are some companies working on it. So it isn't, it's ready, but probably because it hasn't been widely adopted yet, it's ready for kind of like slow beta testing kind of. So it's not, we don't want, you know, all of however many federal employees to suddenly start using this and then we discover, oh, there's a bug. I think that, you know, the way that adoption happens is slowly, and we, you know, kind of see how it works. Okay, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, no, and I think I'll also let you in a minute kind of give the rundown, the basic rundown of anonymous credentialing systems as well. But the point you made about the example you used about the, you know, access to a classified building reminds me of an issue that we worked on several years ago, which was the fallout from the Senate torture report investigation, where basically the folks within the CIA were monitoring logs of access records that the Senate investigators were to see which documents they were looking at. And the Senate found out about it and was a huge scandal, and then now is the subject of a major movie. So there's just one other example of a system where, you know, if you had a system where all it was doing was authenticating that someone was allowed to access these documents and not creating a specific log of what they looked at, then you wouldn't have had potentially that problem.
Right. Yeah. So you don't know if it's the Senate staff looking at it, or the actual CIA people themselves internally.
Right.
Yeah.
Great. So yeah, why don't you just kind of give us the quick rundown of what you've worked on over the years and the basics of the systems that you've been researching.
So my my technical contributions are in signature schemes that lend themselves to the design of these privacy preserving authentication systems, where instead of showing you my signature in the clear signature, my certificate. So depending on how well you know your HTTPS, you might remember that when you connect to a website, let's say Epic's website, how do I know that I've connected to the correct website? Is your website supposed to have a certificate that says, yes, some certification authority, I don't know, VeriSign, says that that the public key that corresponds to Epic is, here it is, and here's some way of authenticating that I'm talking to the owner of this public key, for example, by signing the outgoing traffic. You can convince me that you really have the secret key that corresponds to your public key, and that's your public key according to VeriSign. So I'm not being spoofed. I really am connecting to Epic. So that is done via a signature scheme. And so the next step is, okay, but can we do it so that you don't show me a certificate in the clear, but I just know that you have a certificate? So the kind of signature schemes that I've been working on are ones that lend themselves to this approach. And I'm going to talk about this again in a more technical level in a minute. So I started looking at it a long time ago as part of my PhD thesis. And then I guess I never stopped, because there are more signature schemes with different, so in cryptography, cryptographic algorithms, when we look at cryptographic algorithms, we don't just care about like their running time and efficiency and ease of implementation. A really important feature is that they don't make too many hardness assumptions. So in theoretical computer science, the biggest open problem is the P versus NP, and I'm not going to go into it, but it's like a very challenging problem that people haven't been able to solve for 4 decades. And basically, because that one's open, a lot of other problems are open, such as is there a polynomial time algorithm to factor large integers into the prime decomposition. And a cryptographic system kind of says, okay, assuming that you cannot factor, or assuming that some other mathematical problem is computationally unsolvable, then we can do something. So just because you give a signature scheme doesn't mean that that's it, the problem is solved, because one signature scheme that I gave, like one of the first ones, was based on something called the strong RSA assumption. That's a great assumption as long as factoring is hard. But what if somebody tomorrow comes up with a polynomial, with an efficient algorithm to factor integers? And it's not, in fact, it's not even hypothetical. A few days ago, Klaus Schnorr, very famous and respected cryptographer, posted a paper where he claimed that he had basically solved factoring. And there's some, I think that it hasn't yet been peer review, but the reviews are sort of, well, maybe he didn't quite calculate the running time correctly. There's some issues, but anyway, it can happen. So we want more signature schemes, and that make different assumptions, so that if one assumption turns out to be false, we have something else to fall back on. So there's a lot of work to do for that reason. And even outside of just kind of doing the same thing over and over again, just under different assumptions, other interesting questions in this area are, what are the applications? What else can we do? So other than just gaining access, can you do something like, well, you can gain access, but only so many times, and after that, you cannot do it anonymously. So just other dimensions to the problem. So I've been working on all kinds of things like that. And then, of course, that's not the only thing that I work on, because you know, the field of cryptography is kind of much more broad. So I've worked on other things like secure protocols, secure multi-party computation, Byzantine agreement, which is basically this: you have a bunch of nodes over the network, and they need to together reach agreement, even though there's an adversary messing them up. So there's, yeah, it's a rather big field.
No doubt. And I guess the one question that I had that you kind of got into earlier with your discussion of NIST is what role do major kind of government entities and private sector entities play in whether these systems can actually like make it to prime time, can get through the phases that you're talking about?
So, I mean, this is kind of my, technologist view, so it might not exactly line up with if you ask somebody who actually works in the government and has more of a perspective of, what you can actually do realistically, especially in the US, when we have 4 years and maybe 8. But so first of all, if we're talking about the US federal government, it has 2 very obvious roles to play. Number one is funding science and funding technology. So most of my work has been funded by the National Science Foundation. So just that, just giving funding to cryptographic research is a big boost to, I think, privacy preserving technologies. And the other really obvious one is the federal government is a very, very large customer. So, a federal contract for an authentication system, such as the one that NIST was talking about, means that this is how it has the potential of kind of setting an example of this is how authentication ought to be done. So those are 2 very, very obvious ones. The less obvious things that the government can do is it can, for example, set policies and laws that have to do with what happens to organizations that that are not careful about protecting personal information. So one thing about using privacy preserving technologies is that whoever's on the receiving end, so let's say that I verify that I'm authorized, but I don't tell them anything else. So now they don't have to protect the information that they didn't learn. So I didn't tell them what my name is. So they're saying, well, we're not learning anything personally identifiable. So our task of protecting information is a lot easier. And so if there's, some law or policy or, I don't know, executive order that says, well, if you do something irresponsible with personal information you collect, then we're going to come after you. Then whoever's on the receive, the verifier says, well, I'm not, luckily I'm not learning anything. So those are the other things that I think the federal government, I mean, that's also quite obvious. Making laws and setting policy is the other thing. But it's not just the government. I mean, organizations, kind of the non-government organizations, especially standards bodies, have a huge role to play in how the internet is architected. Most of internet protocols were developed as part of this kind of open standards efforts, and the way that open standards come together is there's some leadership from standards organizations that are, that have something to do with the government. So for example, NIST was instrumental in developing, standards like AES, like the encryption algorithms that we use very, very widely, and also signing algorithms that are used very widely. So NIST has a role to play in kind of in leading the process of adopting standards for how things are done. And it doesn't have to be NIST. There are other standards bodies that are more kind of what's called stakeholder based, and they're usually done by volunteers. But NIST has a role to play in bringing people who are professional to the process and in kind of taking taking charge of it and being a leader. Does that answer your question? Was there another component to your question, like organizations like Epic?
Yeah, definitely. I think that that definitely answers us to government. I
Yeah.
think, yeah,
Yeah.
the question is with major,
Yeah.
are there major players in the space or entities that are working so much in like identity that are sort of like building the software, building the applications that are key to this?
So, okay, so if we kind of move away from the government and look at the private sector, so I think that it's sort of hard for me to kind of separate what's sort of a trend and what are actual products that people are actually working on. But there's a lot of buzz in the private sector about something called self-sovereign identity, which so most online resources we use today, all of our information is out there in the cloud. All we need to do is log in, and then they handle it. And so if whoever's in the cloud decides that that they're just going to, steal my identity, they can, because they have all the information. Self-sovereign identity is, as kind of a concept, as an industry concept, says that's not acceptable. We cannot have all this personal data living in the cloud and being controlled by cloud providers. Instead, it should be controlled by the actual individuals. So, and that's not a new concept. I'm actually gonna, it actually goes back to Epic Advisory Board member David Chaum is probably the first one who sort of had the insight that this is kind of important, that individuals have control of our data. But anyway, in the last few years, I think that there has been a lot of buzz around that concept in the private sector, in Silicon Valley. And a lot of it has to do with people kind of being excited about cryptocurrencies and about blockchains, which I don't know, there are many ways of defining it. And I don't want to be like one of these blockchain evangelizers, because I'm very skeptical about cryptocurrencies, actually. But anyway, that's an aside. But I think there's a lot of excitement about the fact that there it is out there, some way of putting information out there that you cannot then remove. So it's there for public consumption. It cannot be changed, and so now all of a sudden you can do things, and this is how cryptocurrencies work: is you associate individuals with private keys, and these private keys now hold the key to your wallet, and now you can do something with that identity. And so all the excitement to do with, not all of it, but like a lot of the excitement to do with cryptocurrency and blockchain kind of translates itself into, oh, well, maybe this would allow us to also do the self-sovereign identity. Now, my more kind of technical view on this is that it's a little bit BS. It's mostly has to do with the fact that a lot of these entrepreneurs, they've never heard of digital signatures before, and now they have. But in their mind, they're linked to cryptocurrencies. I don't think cryptocurrencies have anything to do with this concept. But anyway, that's a separate issue. But I think that there is some buzz about it, and that's not, of course, not the same as saying, oh, there's actually something's going to happen. And then, okay, then outside of Silicon Valley, in the more kind of boring domain of established software companies and established, they're called federated identity providers. So these are companies that actually handle figuring out, okay, so you're this user, that means that I'm going to give you some kind of an authentication token, and you can go to this domain, and then you can have access to whatever they say. So federated identity is a way of allowing you to log in once to this federated identity provider, and then they guide you from there. And there are a lot of companies that do this kind of stuff. And the reason that I think that they've sort of looking into more privacy preserving ways of doing it is because I'm hearing from them that they're looking at standards. They're kind of sort of moving in that direction. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and is that related to the efforts, the trend towards single sign-on, or alternatively, I guess in a somewhat different, maybe different direction, what Apple has been doing with its, I don't remember exactly what they call it, but they've developed in some use cases a situation where you can essentially create a user account through your Apple ID that will use basically like a randomized email address, so that the end company doesn't actually, the account that's created with the end company isn't your email address.
Yeah, so the single sign-on, I think that it's a very it's attractive to users because it's overwhelming to have to sign into so many places. So yeah, that's where the kind of the pressure comes from. Like, okay, we want a single sign-on, but we don't want to be responsible so much. So we want to outsource some of it to the user, him or herself, or themselves. Yeah, so what are the other things, the other bodies that are in between that are playing a role?
Any of the entities that are involved in that single sign-on, like ecosystem, or as you mentioned, that are trying to develop these federated identity systems are potentially driving what the what underlying technologies they bake into that all over the place. And we're still talking, we were just talking about your work on anonymous credentials. So why don't you go ahead and
okay, good. All right,
that.
Sure. Can you see my screen?
Yep, looks great.
All right, good. So, so to begin my presentation, what's your identity online? When you're online, what makes you you? So we don't actually know what makes us us, but René Descartes said, well, I think, therefore I am. So online, I log in, therefore I am, but only provided that no one else can log in as me. So it's a little bit of an out-of-body experience because cloud providers embody your online life. So the contrast to that, as I already mentioned, is this concept of self-sovereign identity where no one else can act on your behalf and no one else controls it, so you are in charge. So as I also mentioned, this self-sovereign identity is not a new concept, but the word self-sovereign identity, they come from this blog piece, but it's not new. In fact, in my opinion, where it comes from is David Chaum's paper from 1984. And I'm just gonna fast forward through that if you want to read it, but in the recorded version, you can just pause and read it. So, but maybe now that there's this buzz, maybe the world is ready for it. So there's some headlines. For example, Tim Berners-Lee has a company that's trying to do this self-sovereign identity. So here's my meme slide, how it started. So this is David Chaum and how it's going. So I should probably mention, I think yesterday, the German government came out with this announcement that they're going to have these vaccination credentials that are totally, users themselves can show that they've been vaccinated for, that they've received a COVID vaccine. And there isn't going to be a central database that says that stores who did or didn't get vaccinated, and instead you get a little certificate in the form of a QR code that has a digital signature on it from a pharmacy that is authorized to vaccinate you. And I think it's also, there's a blockchain somehow in it, which I assume the blockchain is for these pharmacies to publish their public keys on the blockchain so that anybody can verify them. So anyway, so it was sort of a vision, but now there's actually something that has that vision explicitly built in from the ground up with these vaccination credentials. Okay, so now I'm going to get a little technical about it and tell you a little bit about the cryptographic foundation. So if we don't care about the privacy preserving part of it, if we just care that the user has the information that allows them to prove that they're authorized, then all we need are digital signature schemes. So here you see some pictures of EPIC advisory board members. So there's with Diffie, and there's Ron Revest. In fact, there's Ron twice. So these pictures are meant to remind us that digital signature schemes that were first proposed in both the paper by Diffie and Hellman, and this is Ralph Merkel, back in the 70s, and then RSA were the first kind of explicit construction of digital signatures, and then Revest. So this is Shafi Goldwasser, Salimi Kali, and Ron Revest. They came up with an actual mathematical formalization of what a digital signature is. So interestingly, there were constructions before there was a definition. And so what's a digital signature? So if you use GPG or PGP, then you think that this is what a digital signature looks like. And I can tell you a little bit of what's under the hood, but I don't know, Alan, should I go into a little bit more of an explanation of what a digital signature scheme is, or should I skip it?
Sure, yeah, you could do a quick version.
All right, okay, so how does a digital signature scheme work? So first thing you do is you create two keys. You have a secret key, which you keep secret just to yourself. And by you, I mean Alice. So let's say that your name is Alice. And you have this signing key that you keep to yourself. And you have this public key that you publish that allows anybody to verify your signature. And just to be concrete, let's use as an example the Robin signature scheme. So Robin signature scheme came out a little bit after RSA, and it has some similarities, but in my opinion, it's easier to explain. So secret key consists of two very large prime numbers, P and Q, and a public key is their product, P times Q. And of course, it's important that the public key hide the secret key, because the secret key is something that allows you to sign. So you don't want the public key to kind of give it away. So for the Robin signatures and also for RSA signatures, it's very important that it'd be hard to factor large integers. So that's how you set it up. Then to sign a message, you use your secret key to compute a signature. So for this example, for the Robin signature, this is why I think it's easy to explain, is that the Robin signature is you just take a square root modulo n of the hash of the message. So it turns out that if you have the factorization of n, then you can compute the square root. And if you don't know how to factor n, then you can't, because in fact, the ability to compute square roots gives you the ability to factor. So if you can factor, then you can compute square roots. And I'm not going to tell you why, but if you think about it and sort of work it out on paper, you might figure it out. And when I say mod n, it means that so you take this s, you multiply it by itself, so you square it, and then you divide modulo n. You divide it by n, and then you take the remainder from the division. So that's what I mean when I say mod n. So an integer reduced to modulus just mean it's just exactly what we'll learn in elementary school. Okay, and that also means that it's okay. But if you want to verify Alice's signature on M, then you use the public key. So for this example, for the Robin example, if you want to verify a Robin signature, then you just check that this signature S, if you square it, you get the same result as what you would get if you hash the message M, modulo n, obviously. Okay, so that's digital signature schemes in general, and specifically with this example of Robin. And I'm not going to give you the technical definition of security because that's too much, but the sort of informal definition is that even though you have signatures on lots of documents, you know the public key, you know Alice's signature on a bunch of documents, possibly even of your own choice, you can't forge a document that she hasn't signed. Okay, so that's what a digital signature looks like. So that's that part of the cryptographic foundations. The other part that if you want to have privacy preserving authentication, what you need is a zero knowledge proof system. So let me explain how it comes into this this picture, and then a little bit how they work. So here's what we want from anonymous credentials. So here's our privacy conscious user, and he's talking to the verifier and is asking for access. And so the verifier says, well, who are you? And he says, it's Bond, James Bond. But of course, he is much too privacy conscious. So instead of telling the verifier his name, he's just going to say, I can tell you, but then I'll have to kill you. And so this doesn't work. So maybe they need to reframe the conversation. So the verifier says, okay, you want access? I don't need to know who you are, but show me your certificate so that you're authorized. And then he can say, well, here's my certificate number 007. Of course, that's not privacy preserving because, okay, I don't have it on the slide, but is Latanya Sweeney also an EPIC advisory board member?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Yeah, so she had this 20 years ago, actually, she had, I'm sure you know this, but if you have this persistent identifier and over the course of using it, you reveal your zip code, your gender, and your date of birth, then basically in 85% of the cases that uniquely identifies you. So instead of showing the verifier his certificate number 007, again, we're down to, I can tell you, but then I'll have to kill you. So the conversation has to be very different. So the verifier should say, instead of showing me, giving me your name or your certificate, you need to convince me that you're authorized. And so, and the answer has to be, here's a proof that convinces you that I'm authorized and doesn't reveal anything else, doesn't reveal any persistent identifiers, nothing at all. So let me tell you what a zero knowledge proof is, crash course. So I'm going to do the crash course in a way that's similar to how I did the crash course on digital signatures, where I just talk really fast and I don't give you the technical definitions, but I give you an example. So I'm going to kind of like explain it, what it is, by giving you an example of something that is a zero knowledge proof. Okay. So, and this is an example that isn't actually used in my work. It's just an example to explain zero knowledge proofs. So, but first let's do a total digression. So let's play this 3-colorability game. So I give you a graph. So a graph is just a collection of nodes and edges. And the game is, and it's similar to Sudoku, this game. So the game is, let's assign a color to every vertex such that no edge is connected to 2 vertices of the same color. So here's a graph. Let's see if we can 3-color it. So just think of it as a game like Sudoku. So let's start by coloring this vertex red, and then this one green, and then this one blue, and then one green and red and blue. And now we're stuck because this last vertex that's left, it has a blue neighbor, a red neighbor, and a green neighbor. So we've run out of colors. Okay, so we failed, but maybe we can still 3-color this graph if we kind of backtrack and correct some of our previous work. And in fact, we can recolor this upper right vertex. Before it was green, but it doesn't need to be green. It can just as easily be blue because all it has is red neighbors so far. So if we recolor it blue, now this remaining vertex is allowed to be colored green. So this is kind of a game. I give you, you get a graph, and the challenge is, can you 3-color it? And so why is this game interesting? So just as an aside, not every graph is 3-colorable. So here's an example of a graph that's not 3-colorable, because no matter how you color the triangle, the outside triangle, you're stuck. There's no color for the vertex in the middle. And this 3-colorability, it's interesting because if you've ever studied computer science, and this will mean something to you, 3-colorability is NP complete, which means that if you can solve 3-colorability, then you can solve anything. Okay, so now I'm going to tell you what zero knowledge proofs are by giving you a zero knowledge proof system that a graph is 3-colorable. So now we have this graph, and we have this prover who wants to convince the verifier that this graph is 3-colorable. And this is, of course, a toy example. So this is a small enough graph that we just figured out how to 3-color it. But for very large graphs, as I said, it's a hard problem. So there isn't an efficient algorithm to solve it. But let's say that this is a large graph. It's hard to three-color it if you don't already know a solution, but our prover somehow already knows the solution. And so he's trying to convince the verifier. So how can he do that without revealing any information? So one thing he could do is he could just say, here we go, here's how you color it. But that's obviously reveals information. That just gives away the whole game of how you three-color it. So that's out. So another approach is to say, okay, so first of all, let's kick the verifier out of the room. So pretend that this graph is kind of in front of us. It's in a room. We kick the verifier out, and then he colors, so the verifier steps out. He colors the graph, and then he covers up all the vertices with paper cups. So this is a large graph, but he colors it, each vertex, and then covers up the colors. And then the verifier arrives and picks an edge at random and just verifies that this edge is colored properly. So, okay. So this is by itself not terribly convincing because the verifier just checked one edge chosen at random. So the prover doesn't know ahead of time which edge was going to be checked, but the prover might have just gotten lucky. So maybe the verifier says, well, that's not good enough. I'm not convinced enough. So then maybe the prover says, well, I'm going to let you check another edge. But that's not a good approach because now we're seeing some structure. So instead of letting him check another edge, we can redo the whole process all over again. So the entire graph has been colored and covered with paper cups. The verifier checks a random edge. And if this edge is proper, if its endpoints are colored distinctly, then the verifier is happy so far. And then they repeat the process again. And when they repeat the process, the first thing that happens is you recolor the whole graph all over again with some random permutation of the original colors, so that seeing the colors of an edge doesn't give you any kind of additional information. So you recolor it, you cover it up with paper cups, then the verifier says, oh, I want to check this edge, and you show it to me. And if we repeat this process many, many times, and the prover is never discovered to have colored an edge with into the same color, then the verifier accepts. So what did I just show you? So, and this is due to one of the first zero knowledge papers from a long time ago, 35 years ago. And the idea, and basically what I tried to show you by this, and I'm not sure that I have communicated it properly, but what I tried to show you is that you can convince a verifier that a statement is true, such as this graph is three-colorable, and I know it's the solution, I know how to three-color it, but in the process, you haven't given up the solution to the puzzle. Because if the graph is not three-colorable, that means that no matter how you color it, there's going to be an edge with endpoints that are colored the same color. And eventually, after 100 tries for this particular graph, and you know, need more, if your graph is bigger, you need more trials, but not that many more. After a large enough number of trials, the verifier will have found it. Just by randomly picking it at random, the verifier will have gotten lucky and will have found the edge where the prover is cheating. So the fact that the verifier haven't found it means that the graph is three-colorable. But every time, if you ask the verifier, well, what have you learned? The verifier says, well, I just saw two random colors. And they're completely random and they're totally unrelated to the last two colors I saw, because he recolored the whole graph all over again using three fresh colors. So that's basically what I'm trying to communicate, is that the verifier is convinced, but he learned nothing. Okay, so, and of course, if you want a protocol that you can do over the internet, you're not going to use these props like paper cups. Instead, you do something like encrypt the color of every vertex, and so you would just communicate zeros and ones. Okay, And then you would repeat the process. And okay. So this is actually a theorem. And this is because graph three colorability is actually an interesting game to play, because you can express any statement that's provable as a graph that if the statement is true, then the graph is three colorable. So because of that, everything provable is provable in zero knowledge, but this is very kind of technical. Okay, so first the question is, you don't need paper cups. And do I use something like this in my work? And no, I just use this kind of as a prop to explain zero knowledge proofs. So what's happening under the hood is much more involved and technical, and I'm not going to tell you, but there's something else happening under the hood that's sort of similar in spirit, but much more efficient. Yeah, and you can do something. So this is sort of, okay, this might be a little bit too technical, but what's happening is the prover sends the verifier something that's a commitment to his or her identity or secret key, and then does a zero knowledge proof that he knows a certificate. And you can do something more interesting, like, for example, you can do a zero knowledge proof that you know more than one certificate, or that the certificate has some interesting properties. So there's a lot of math stuff, and I'm going to skip that. But what's actually is important is that you can do things like selective disclosure of identity attributes. So you can have a certificate in which the signature is not just on your identity, but there's also some other statements about you. So for example, it can include, okay, this is your name, your date of birth, your address, I don't know, your blood type. And then depending on what you need to disclose, you can disclose a subset of these attributes, or even maybe some function of them, such as, for example, if a certificate has your date of birth and you want to prove that you're over 18 for some reason, then you just prove that you're over 18 using a zero knowledge proof, but you don't disclose exactly what your age is. You can also do something like this limited use. So you can have an anonymous credential that you can use, but you can only use it a certain number of times. If you use it more than that, then it becomes non-anonymous. You can do something like called identity escrow, which means that you're not really fully anonymous. With your transaction, you also hand over an encryption of your identity under some trusted party's public key. So, for example, in this, you have this clearance to access some resource, but we do want some potentially to be able to do like a Senate investigation where we will find out who it was. So in that case, your identity is encrypted, your actual identity is encrypted under a public key of like the Senate committee that's authorized to investigate what happened. And then there's revocation. You can revoke these anonymous credentials, even though they're anonymous. Okay. And the last thing that I want to talk about, and this comes up a lot when we talk about privacy preserving authentication, is that, of course, if you're doing things anonymously, it's an invitation for abuse. And the most obvious kind of abuse, that like the first thing that comes to mind is, well, if Alice is an authorized user, let's say she's, I don't know, a New York Times subscriber, well, and she's anonymous, so nobody actually knows that it's her reading the New York Times, then what stops her from just sharing her subscription with all of her friends? And now, New York Times is out of a lot of money because, for the price of one subscription now, Alice and her 2,000 best friends are reading the paper. So that is often raised as kind of an objection to, like, why do we want anonymous credential? And I have a bunch of answers to them because I've been working on this so long. So so the first answer, and the most obvious one, is that the problem is not anonymity, because you can already do that even when Alice is not anonymous. There's nothing stopping her from sharing her subscription to the New York Times with her 2,000 best friends. So anonymity is not introducing this problem. It becomes the only thing that's changed if it's anonymous authentication is that now not only can Alice share this, but now you can't even see that that Alice is logging in too many times. Like you don't see any activity that would look suspicious, that would kind of alert you to, oh, maybe Alice is sharing her subscription with her friends. So maybe what we want is anonymous credentials so that her privacy can be protected, and yet limited use, so that she can share it, but only up to a point, because if her credentials are used too many times, then she can be traced. So that's the other answer. And then, of course, other things is that, well, you can use things like, well, if you know that Alice is doing this, then you can revoke her credential. You can also include things like identity escrow, so that after the fact, you can investigate what happened and who it was. You can make Alice's secret key very valuable to share. For example, if this is the same secret key that she uses to log into her bank, then it becomes very valuable, and she doesn't want to share it with all of her friends because she doesn't want them to have access to her financial data. And then you can also make it very hard for her to share her secret key because it is stuck in secure hardware. So in other words, there's something to discuss here. Anonymity may be an invitation to abuse, but there are ways to counteract that. And then I think this is my last slide. So in terms of what's been implemented and used, so actually some of this has been implemented a long time ago, because there's this direct anonymous attestation, which is in every chipset, but nobody's using it. So it's implemented but not used. And then a lot of these algorithms were implemented as part of this IBM effort called Idemix. And so there are libraries that do most of this. Not necessarily used, but they exist. So it's usable. It's possible to create products that do this. Then, oh yes, this is actually very worth mentioning. There's an effort, I think Hyperledger is an effort that's joined between the Linux Foundation and some companies. They formed this Hyperledger consortium. And as part of it, there are a couple of libraries that also implement, so software libraries that do this. And there are actually a couple of companies that are building products off from these libraries. So there are some kind of pilots of this stuff. Apparently the government of British Columbia uses anonymous credentials to grant certain law licenses, actually. And I haven't really looked at how successful this pilot has been, but it's out there. Then I did an academic grade implementation a while ago called Brownie Points. And then there are other efforts, and not everything's in the public domain. I'm involved with a startup company where we're trying to do this as well. So there's some movement in the right direction. So that's it. Those are all my slides.
Thank you. That's really great. I mean, to be able for us to get that kind of a distillation of these very complicated concepts is super helpful in our work.